Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's ContainerJournal.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Container Journal. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead of us, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of the talk or you would just like to share it with a friend, an on-demand recording will be made available after the webinar concludes today. If you look on the right side of your screen, you'll see a couple options. The first tab I'll direct you to is the Q&A tab. This is where we want you to send in any questions you might have for our speakers. We're going to try to address as many as we can, so be sure to send them in early and often. Right next to that Q&A tab, you'll find the chat tab. And this is where we want you guys to talk with one another, share your experience and expertise, or just tell us from where you're tuning in. And finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So stick around to see if you're one of our 4 lucky winners. But our topic today is cloud native data protection. And I'm joined today by Justin McCarthy, CTO and co-founder of StrongDM, Bill Reese, product marketing director at Everbridge, and Chris Rogers, technology evangelist at Zerto. And moderating today's discussion will be Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer with Techstrong Group. It is my pleasure at this point in time to turn the floor over to Mike to get our panel started. Mike, thanks so much.
All right, and thank you for all joining us today. It's going to be a great panel. Hey, let's just get started with some explanation of exactly what cloud native data protection means. I'm going to ask the question to Chris first. And the thing I would point out is I think we've been doing data protection to varying degrees, sometimes not as well as we might for decades. What exactly is different about data protection as it applies to cloud native? What should people be thinking about? And what are some of the challenges, Chris?
Yeah, thanks everyone. So yeah, as you said, we've been doing it for a long time, and as you mentioned, maybe not as well as or as broad as we should have been. But yeah, cloud native does bring some new challenges. You know, the stateful versus stateless, where the data is actually held, the different platforms, how the actual applications architected is completely different, and the underlying platforms are different as well. Normally with cloud native, kind of that abstraction layer is even further away from what we're used to. Even in the VM world or the physical world, we can see the storage, we know what it is, how it's constructed, we can kind of understand it. But cloud natives, that's even more abstracted away from us. So it's understanding how our apps put together, where the data actually lives, and what data actually needs protecting, right? Because we have got different ways of protecting the data. But also making sure we maintain access to that data as well. It's okay just protecting the data, but if we're talking data protection as well, it's also disaster recovery and backup. And if we have a disaster, making sure we can get to the data as well, having a copy of it. But if the associated infrastructure and containers and etc. aren't there for us to access it, then that's still a problem for us, right? So, but we do need to think differently. The scenarios are different, the people are different. And how we think about data protection should be different as well.
Bill, you got anything you want to add to that? Anything that you see out there from your perspective? You work a lot in the DevOps perspective. So is there something that people should be looking at a little harder than they do?
Well, I don't know about looking at harder specifically, but I know that business operations changes with the fact that we're dealing with cloud data protection. You look at it from a perspective of now we've got intellectual property online. I know that's something that's been growing and growing and growing, but that's still the concern and worry about the different businesses and assets as well. And then making sure that they've got a constant connection to ensure that data is upright and then again protected. So it's kind of an overview thing, not just a specific operation, but an overall business operation as well.
Justin, you got anything you want to add in there?
Also what I think Chris used the word abstracted, and I would also just use the word flexibility. So of course, one of the signatures of flexibility is that it creates far more options to be creative, create innovative applications. But then all of that flexibility, of course, also leads to situations where it's just very easy to have maybe more copies of your data than you expect to have. And so just that having that inventory, knowing where everything is, was never easy. And it's trickier still when you might have a representation that, is maybe a first-class representation that one of the public clouds might understand, like an object in S3, but then maybe that object is a fraction of a file system that's used by a Kubernetes cluster, right? And so so having all of those options available, certainly expands the level of difficulty for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely more data floating around than people normally appreciate. Chris, speaking of that data, you mentioned stateful applications. Are we seeing more of these stateful applications now on Kubernetes itself? What's driving that? Because a lot of the times it was always stateless before that. And is that changing? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, from what I'm seeing in the marketplace, I think we are seeing more stateful applications. That's just my perspective anyway. And I think maybe the reason for that, I think, as I say, more enterprise or larger companies who weren't born in the cloud, companies kind of come online. That's one of the easiest ways to store data with the container, right? They can store it with a persistent volume claim and store it with it. Is a bit more traditional, if you will. And kind of, I think that's maybe why we're seeing more, was why I'm seeing more anyway, of those stateful containers and storing that data inside the container. I don't know what everyone else is seeing, but that's kind of what I see from the marketplace that I work in and operate in.
All right. Bill, are you seeing much the same from a DevOps perspective?
Yeah, exactly. I would fully agree with that. That's exactly what we're seeing, and exactly one of the things that they're bringing to light even more as companies grow. And if they're not, as it was said, right, if they're not from the ground up for internet capabilities or SaaS platforms or anything of that nature, then yeah, they're having to make do with what they got and starting to build out and then understanding as they go.
Yeah. Justin, about that question, there was a time when people were saying you should only deploy stateless applications on Kubernetes. Is that changing because the convergence of the platform and it's more about the management side of it rather than is whether it's stateless or stateful? Of course, some people would say there's no such thing as a stateless application because eventually that data winds up somewhere. But what is your sense of what's the right balance between this stateful, stateless argument? Is it more of a philosophical argument than it is a technical reality? What do you think?
My hunch is that the technical reality became possible, that the technical reality changed when on average state stopped meaning magnetic disks. So when state could have high IOPS, I think then whether you organized it into a VM, a container, or a container within an orchestrated cluster, it was just a matter of time before the ecosystem was going to mature to a point where stateful containers were no longer controversial, I guess. So that's my hunch, is that if you can rely on a performant IO subsystem, then yeah, it's less worry about exactly how it's packaged. But then we're right back to that, increasing power and flexibility leads to situations where you do create a lot of copies of information that maybe you didn't have a chance to revisit your data classification or your data handling or any of the other sort of procedures that you do want to attend to when the data is sensitive.
Hey, Bill, in theory, people have workflows, they have playbooks, so they have something that they execute to manage these processes. When we look at microservices now and serverless computing frameworks and containers and the things that we describe that make up cloud native, does that change the way I need to think about how I set up a DevOps workflow that includes data protection? Are the processes changing? Do they need to become more automated? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think so. I think, ultimately we're looking for a fix it and forget it type scenario. That's not going to happen anytime soon, in my opinion. But yeah, it's going with the mindset of, once this information is in a container, once it's microservices available to, customers to use and everything, it's what do we do with it? Is it needs to go from automation from the time the code is written, or does it need to go orchestrated from a point of now it's up in the container or the microservice is fully built? it comes down to what is the ultimate goal? What are we trying to do with it? And then how are we going to go in and protect it at the end of the day? Is it something that's going to be a constant protection? Yes, no, it could be, depending upon what type of data it is, also what type of service it is. So I think you've got to start from the ground up thinking that way. And if not, then you better start implementing it somewhere down the road, because it does leave code and intellectual property vulnerable overall.
Chris, are you starting to see people execute more sophisticated playbooks and strategies around data protection in this new cloud native era, or were we still early days, and what will it take to get them to the next level?
I think a strong bit of both. I think people have moved into the cloud native and still protecting them as they were, if they were VMs or whether they were physical. So still just protecting underlying storage, for instance. But what we're doing at Zerta is actually we're putting it inside of the kind of the developer's hands, right? So we're utilizing data protection as code. So rather than it being an afterthought, actually putting the data protection inside of your manifest for your Kubernetes application. So when that application gets spun up, that container is born protected, right? There's no other way of doing it. There's no afterthought. So we can be inside of those CI/CD pipelines, right? It's not something that you have to have a separate team manage. And I think that's another kind of thing that is different as we move into the developers and the DevOps world. Do they really want to be worrying about data protection for an app they created 6 months ago, 12 months ago, or do they want to be looking at the new app they're creating and developing that, right? And so what they're probably going to offload it to an ops team or a data protection team who maybe don't understand Kubernetes or cloud native as much as the DevOps guys. So yeah, we're trying to put that back into those DevOps guys' hands by allowing them to utilize data protection as code. So I would still say there are still a lot of people using like legacy solutions, so snapshots or store or just protecting the underlying storage platform, or even just the VM that the container is running inside. But I think it should change. I think the people will realize there are gaps in that way of working, and there are native applications out there that will protect Kubernetes applications better than just protecting underlying storage or something like that.
All right, Justin, we used to get people right out of school, and the first job they were given was to manage data protection, and they were given a GUI tool, and basically they were on the maintenance crew. Is that shifting in terms of who's in charge of data protection now? Is it much more part of that DevOps team? And do they see that, or is it maybe they think that they're too focused on the high-end automation stuff to really think about the data protection equation, and that's maybe creating an issue?
I guess my answer is largely a function of where I spend my day. So I think our angle on it at StrongDM is always about who is accessing that data. So it sounds like, whereas Chris, it sounds like in the manifest and specifying how the volumes are ultimately handled and maybe what happens to the data as it's flowing through backup and how that interacts with encryption. It sounds like that may be where you're focused. Ultimately, a human operator does need to be involved to debug, diagnose, interact with a cluster or a server or a database, even a database running inside of Kubernetes. And so being very explicit and actually manifesting that access itself that those humans are undertaking to operate the system. Even if it's someone just out of school, as long as you're explicit about it and it's intentional, then anyway, that's the biggest part of our day to day is really being explicit and specifying what humans do with that protected data.
Bill, do you think DevOps teams are heavily involved in data protection, or are they all focused on, let me get this whole continuous integration and maybe someday continuous delivery thing working, and I'll worry about protection later, or that's somebody else's job?
No, I think they need to be more aware of it, if not actively doing it. And it goes back to what Justin just said, right? You've got somebody that's in there that's building out the code, going in and containerizing it or putting it inside the database, or building up a platform, but they still need to be aware of that. Now, it may be that you've got 1, 2 individuals that are responsible for checking it and making sure that it is protected, making sure that all the backups and all the encryptions happen. But honestly, I think it's everybody's responsibility in one way, shape, or form to make sure that your data is protected.
Yeah. Chris, how automated will all this get? We talked about there's still a need for human intervention, but we are seeing advances in automation. You basically can't wake up in the morning these days without somebody talking about machine learning algorithms and AI did this, that, or the other. So as we go along here, will this whole process become more automated, and how smart can smart get?
I think undoubtedly it will get more automated. Everything gets everything gets that way. I don't think data protection will be any different. But I still think, what Justin and Bill just mentioned earlier, that I still think there needs to be a human element, because essentially these, potentially billion-dollar companies who are running applications, they still need that human check to make sure that things are running correctly. And even if a report says it has, making sure we are doing testing and we're doing test restores and things like that for when things do go wrong, it's still going to be hugely important and part of the data protection strategy. So I fully expect machine learning and AI and all these things to take over, and actually deciding what gets protected and potentially how it gets protected, and the SLAs that are assigned to those. But actually I think some of the more critical pieces, like the checking and the reporting and potentially the testing and the restores, will actually still be human based, because I think there's still a long way to go until we get to the point where infrastructure knows exactly what's happened and when it needs to go back to, and can do that automatically for us. And when that does happen, I think we will lose our jobs, right?
We'll see what happens. Bill, do you think we'll see some higher levels of automation, and what might that look like in a DevOps context? Because DevOps, at the end of the day, it's all about ruthless automation. It's let's get rid of all the drudgery. Data protection is important, but perhaps not the most fun task in the world. So, if you get your crystal ball out, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I think some of the things we're seeing is, if we look at trends overall, is that there are minor mundane things that are being already automated. You look at restarting services. I know Kubernetes is doing a lot with that as far as restarting, checking, make sure that everything's going. But crystal ball looking forward is outside of the mundane. I think there's got to be that human intervention. I think there's going to be, security officers that are looking at it from a higher level, saying, okay, we've got 15 applications, which of those need protecting? Or is it something that is, I think it was Justin mentioned a while ago, is it's 15 years old. Am I going to go in and protect that? Maybe. Depends on what's going on, or if it's a new iteration coming out. So I think overall there is going to be more automation, but I echo Chris with the fact that there is going to be and needs to be human intervention in some way. It's some shape or form.
I don't know, Justin, do you agree, or will someday this just be a bot somewhere that's taking care of all of this for us?
I maybe I don't have as strong an instinct on what might come with respect to automation, other than it's the same trend line for everything else. That what does occur to me is this tension between the replication, backups, and protection and security. Having an application that's available, having an application that has great recovery time characteristics, inevitably means that you just have more copies of the data. And so anytime you have more with sensitive information, you're going to have a bigger surface area. And so absolutely, we have to have automation that keeps pace with that expansion. And I'm sure that's something you folks have thought a lot about, Chris.
Mm-hmm. All right. Chris, well, let me ask you, historically we had backup and recovery, and then there was disaster recovery was a separate app, and there was archiving was always a separate thing. Is all of that going to converge now as we go along here, because they're all going to be tied into these kind of microservices architectures, or what will be the hierarchy of things that we use for protection of data?
Yeah, I think the products may. I think we've already seen the convergence of DR and backup across products already kind of starts happen, if not already happened. My company Zerto kind of does both already. But But I think the use case is still kind of a very distinct in terms of the people who use them. Sometimes even separate teams inside the companies, but also kind of the desired outcomes for those use cases generally seem to be different. And I think when we're talking cloud native, disaster recovery takes on a different form, because we're probably not talking about a data center fire or a plane hitting the data center, because we are going to be potentially in the cloud across region and across availability zones and all those types of things, and a well architected application will be able to withstand some amount of failure. But things like, as we've seen, like ransomware start attacking containers and things like that, the threat will change, and the landscape will change. So I still think backup and disaster recovery will still remain as separate entities in terms of the backup use case being for the small amounts of data and maybe slightly end user focused or that type of thing. But I think disaster recovery will be for those big incidents where there's a big application that someone relies on somewhere, that's their main money making application, and they need that back up and running as quickly as possible from all outages, right? Whether that's what Justin was mentioning earlier about having it geolocated and having more copies of the same data somewhere so it's more available, or whether that is a data protection solution where we can recover you really, really quickly in another cloud provider, for instance. And again, I think that got covered earlier. Having that flexibility, I think, is going to be key. Not putting all your eggs in one basket somewhere, and actually having the ability to maybe replicate that data to another platform and have it available in another platform, ready to spin up, ready to go, just in case. And we've seen AWS have outages recently that affected quite a lot of services for quite a lot of big companies. So I think the two design centers will still be distinct, but I think the products that are going to solve them or be bought for those purposes will probably merge and be, you'll probably buy one or the other in that space, I would imagine.
Bill, do you think that, at least if you look at microservices, the idea here is that the application is more resilient, right? And part of the reason we have so many copies of data is that should a microservice fail, another one will take that call and the application may slow down, but it won't totally fall over. Do you think, though, if that's the case, that maybe people will get a little too comfortable and not account for all the issues that can go wrong, and then they won't do data protection because they'll think that the architecture somehow or other of the application is going to solve these issues for
them? So I think one of the things that we say internally at Everbridge is that, comfort in resilience, which means that basically too many people do get comfortable. So it's just like you said. Too many people get comfortable with the fact that things are resilient, but they don't take into account that you've got changes in code, changes in how things are being handled. It could be, one microservice that's handled this way, but because of the continual development cycle, it changes day to day. And somebody might not have uploaded the latest code, or they've developed it and it's stored somewhere and somebody forgot about the data protection aspect of it. So I think that we do get a little too comfortable with the fact that, everything's automated or is becoming automated, so I don't have to worry about it. And that goes back to that fix it and forget it mindset that I think a lot of companies are doing, that they're becoming more aware, but they're becoming more aware because they have to, simply for what's going on as far as cybersecurity goes.
All right, Justin, do you think we have the same concerns? Will we lean too much on automation? I remember talking to one fellow about automation. He said, it's one thing to be wrong. It's quite another thing to be wrong at scale. We could be wrong at scale here. So what's your sense of, are developers going to get too comfortable?
I would say I generally have an optimistic view of the trend line. So there may be periods of where we haven't learned a new tool chain yet, and actually one that I would point to is maybe we have some great standardization around expressing how you want your containers to be deployed and spin up and spin down, or we have a great standard, pretty good standard, or let's say some accepted conventions about approximately how an object storage API should look. But one standard that hasn't really applied across all of these is just fundamentally, expressing concepts like encryption itself. So having a standardized way of sharing a key outside of just one cluster, for example, and maybe across multiple different technology types, and then revoking that key, for example. So that's an area where, in order to have some sort of generalized design, I think, assumptions, I'd definitely love to see more development. I know we think about standardizing audited access to systems, and that's what we do all day long. So all the access is audited in a very consistent way. That's the human access side of it, the hugely important piece. I would love to be able to say the same thing for how keys are handled, rather than having how keys are handled in S3 versus how keys are handled in Azure versus how keys are handled in our vanilla K8s cluster that we're operating.
All right, well, Chris, that sounded like a request. So where is the rest of the industry in terms of developing standards in that regard? And, what progress are we making in the sense of things that could span multiple platforms and be reused and take the friction out of the equation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cloud native or the Kubernetes community specifically is very good at actually coming together and writing out these things and actually flattening these things out, making it easier for everyone to use. But I think as soon as we get to third-party areas and those things that plug into all these things, there's always going to be different ways of doing things, because that's how people get edges, right? And that's how different companies are created and how different things are born, right? So specifically with data protection, there's so many different ways of protecting the data. So like at Zerto, for instance, we do everything on a continuous basis. We don't believe that anything should be done on a periodic basis, especially in Kubernetes, because things happen so quickly. So everything is done continuously, whereas there's other vendors out there will be doing things more periodically or doing things on a platform level. So I think there's always going to be disparity, and I think it will be kind of down to the people who run and own and operate these platforms to decide what's best for them and how to do things. But I do agree with Justin. It'd be great if there was just a one-size-fits-all approach for everything. I mean, key management would be great, but things like data protection, I think, is so unique to the company that's going to use it, to what their SLAs are. And one thing that doesn't really change in data protection is RPO and RTO are the two key elements, right? That's going to vary by organization to organization, and even app by app, and potentially even microservice by microservice. So yeah, I'd love to say that we're gonna be the. I would love for Zerto to become the default Kubernetes data protection tool. I would absolutely love that, but I don't think it will happen overnight. And I think there'll be different use cases for different tools, and obviously cost comes into it as well. Like if you're buying a tool that can do things faster or quicker or better or cheaper, then that goes into that marketplace, and people have to figure out which one's right for them, right?
Bill, when I look inside a lot of these organizations, I'll see 4 or 5 different data protection solutions with different vendors that were acquired at different times by different teams for different reasons. Is there anything you'd like to see happen in the way of standardization that would make your life easier, or should people just try to standardize on one platform, and is that possible?
Well, so and again, this goes back to my opinion, right? So I think there's 2 schools of thought, right? Number one, start somewhere. If it is, I've got to use 5 different tools to do one job, then so be it. Just do something. The other side of it is I would love to see where there is a standardization to where we're not worrying about, we can go from a cyber perspective or we can go from just a data perspective, is making sure that everything is on level, on par, as Justin mentioned, encrypted, as Chris mentioned, is automated all the way to the end. I would like to see that, and I think it'll come, but then there's a long way to go to get there.
Chris, do you have any sense of where the line is between what the open source community around Kubernetes is doing as it relates to data protection versus where does a vendor add value, and where should people think about that equation, and what's the relationship between the community and the vendors who deliver products around it?
I think I think the community have done absolutely amazing things with data protection. There's projects out there that to help people protect their data in Kubernetes, free of charge. You can go and use it and do everything. I think where the challenge really comes in is that when you've got your company and the company revenue relying on that, I'm not sure the CEO will sign off potentially on a community thing with no SLAs and no support agreements and those types of things. As if your application goes down and data protection is your last resort to get it back up again, then potentially you may want something a little bit more bolstered than a community. But I think the community done a great job, and a lot of the actual vendors are actually sharing pieces of code anyway inside of the community to help bolster people and help. I think that's a good part of being a good vendor in the cloud native or Kubernetes space is actually sharing some of that stuff. And but yeah, I think when it comes really down to the crunch, I think depending on what you're trying to protect, I think an IT vendor adds a bit of, I suppose, a security blanket or a safety net underneath the product to kind of have that, there's someone there 24/7. When you ring up, you can get a guy who knows everything about it to get you back up and running as quickly as possible, and get your data back from whenever you need it back from. So that's kind of where I sit on it.
All right, Justin, do you agree? Can I rely on upstream Kubernetes alone, or should I perhaps have somebody holding my hand and curating this stuff and providing that level of support that most folks are going to need?
I think the great thing about Kubernetes is I think the thing that it's we've seen, even separate from data protection, just Kubernetes in general, is from this one shared metaphor and shared model. Actually, many vendors have been able to create commercialized implementations that that help avoid mistakes, right? So they just make it easier to operate, easier to avoid those critical, typically maybe availability, but also security mistakes. So I would say, in terms of commercial products, I would look for the standards to be expressed in Kubernetes itself, but then the implementation to be particularly robust, particularly easy to use when I'm choosing, a particular branded version, I would say.
All right, Bill, do you agree with that? Because a lot of DevOps folks seem to just want to download code wherever they can find it. The last thing they want to do is get involved with a purchasing process, but you kind of go on your own, and maybe you're asking for trouble.
And I do look at it that way. So I have to agree with both Justin and Chris, is that, we forget about one thing. And if you're looking at buying a vehicle as an example, you buy gap insurance, right? Yes, we've got this one aspect of protecting specific parts and pieces, but we may forget the underlying code that we've downloaded from the community. So we've got a couple of different ways that we have to look at that. And I know there's been, a couple of vulnerabilities here lately that have done just that, right? They've exposed not specifically Kubernetes community, but they have exposed different freeware, shareware, open source applications to harmful things. And the problem is that we may protect against it in a small area, but not necessarily overall in the larger picture. And so it goes back to Chris's aspect of I don't think we're going to get somebody to sign off on a freeware type solution when there needs to be a bigger standardization as far as encryption, things of that goes.
All right. Hey, Chris, a lot of these containers are running on Kubernetes clusters, and those in turn run on virtual machines. And a lot of people would say, well, I already protected the virtual machine. I bought something that did that, and everything that sits on top of that is covered. So do I really need a cloud native solution? And what is the relationship between what I used to do with my virtual machine backup and recovery versus cloud native? And are they separate products, or can they all be just one product that covers the whole gamut?
There'll be vendors out there like Zerto who will be able to protect your virtual machines and your K8 apps all in one, right? One platform, and you can utilize one interface, and it looks the same and feels the same and things. But I think doing data protection in cloud native and Kubernetes apps should be done because of the natively. I think natively, instead of being just for the VMs. yes, you're protecting the data in a way, but I think that's going to massively affect RTO. You bringing that VM up and then having to make sure the containers come up and all that kind of stuff. And it doesn't really help if you're using like one of the major cloud platforms, because you can't actually protect the VM because you can't see it underneath, right? There's a deployed cluster. It's as I said, kind of the first thing, it's all abstracted away from you. So I would say that if you're using just a VM or protection on a VM or the storage layer, how does that translate if you decided to move to AWS or you move to GCP or you move your protection strategy or somewhere else? How does that translate? So making sure you can kind of cover for all scenarios rather than just the one you're in now.
So if I heard that correctly, I think what you're saying is you may have one platform, but there are different processes and use cases for that platform depending on the nature of the workload and what's being protected, and you have to take all that into account, but you want the one console to manage it all. Is that about right?
Yeah, like one console or one vendor to deal with. If you have got this hybrid infrastructure where you've got maybe even some physicals, or you've got some load of virtual machines still when you're moving into K8s and cloud native and even SaaS applications, if you can protect that under one vendor, and they do a great job of protecting everything under one hood, then why wouldn't you go for them, right? Because it simplifies the buying process and all the support processes as well. But equally, if you have got something that's protecting your VMs today and they don't offer a Kubernetes native, or they're saying, oh, exactly what you said, we're protecting the VM, so that's fine. I would just reconsider and actually think about what would happen and what's the workflows to get you back up and running on that containerized application. Because yes, restoring the VM is fine, and you may be able to restore everything, but it's going to take time and a lot of manual process. And as we kind of discussed on this, everything is about automation and speed, right? So we don't want to be wasting time trying to bring things back up if we can. And again, that doesn't translate into the platforms that are abstracted, so the GCPs and the EKS and that type of thing. That you can't protect VMs there. You have to protect the Kubernetes application itself. You can't protect VMs.
Chris and Mike, the other element that occurs to me is, when you're seeing something that can natively understand containers themselves, you're going to benefit presumably from a better understanding of isolation. So one VM is going to have many containers on it. You might have very different policies amidst those and among those. If it were okay to have no isolation, then the operating systems we use would be single user operating systems, and file permissions wouldn't exist on those single user operating systems, right? So I think VMs themselves are a way to isolate, and just of course containers are further containers of isolation within those VMs.
Right. Bill, can I get to that ideal where I have the one platform and the one console to manage all these different use cases? And I'm asking the question because the CIO in most organizations will be like, let's get one vendor and standardize, we'll save money. But then, you get down to the individual IT teams and the development teams, and they all decide to do something slightly different. So can I effectively enforce a standard, or do we have to kind of just let people do what they want to do because that's what they're comfortable with?
Well, I think sometimes we need to take comfort out of it. Can we enforce a standard? Is the short answer is yes. However, that standard needs to be adjustable over a period of time. Maybe we bring somebody in to say, hey, we're going to meet twice a week, once a week, whatever, as the standard is being built out, to find out, do we need data cloud protection? Do we need a point product protection? Do we need something specific around just monitoring the VMware? Do we need, the list goes on. But I think overall, we will get to that single pane of glass, so to speak. And I hate to use the cliche, but I think we will get to, one place to see everything. And in doing so, it may be that there's multiple feeds into seeing from that one vendor pane, if you will. So it's coming from different aspects, different areas, and different monitoring tools, as we already see, as well as different alerts coming from various tools, not just because people are comfortable, but because that's what works for that specific application or that specific service or that specific data container, so to speak. So I think we'll get there. I think it's going to take a little bit of best in breed to get there, though.
Hey, Chris, we were all taught back in the day that, data protection has to have this 3-2-1 strategy around it. There's the one archive up in the cloud in case all goes to hell, and then there's 3 copies and stuff in the middle that helps you recover quickly, and in theory that should all work. But in the land of microservices and cloud natives, and containers are ripped and replaced all the time. So does that 3-2-1 model still work, or do I wind up with the scenario where what Justin was pointing out, where we have so many copies of the same data that we're backing up the same data over and over again? So how do we bring some rational processes to that whole effort so we're not duplicating the same backup of the data over and over again?
Yeah, I still think as a general rule, I think it's still a good rule to have, right? I don't think, it's been there for a long time. It hasn't changed drastically. People have amended it and tried to do some clever things around it. But I still think having more copies of your data, like as long as they're managed properly, is a good thing. And then I think with the flexibility and the agnosticity that Kubernetes brings, I think storing data in multiple platforms can only be a good thing as well, right? Don't just rely on your one sole hyperscale provider, because that may go wrong, right? They do have problems, and it's not just in localized, sometimes it's whole regions, or even bigger than that. So having something in a different location is I think still relevant. So if you're on premise, have something in the cloud. If you're in cloud, have it in a different cloud. I still think that's important. And having multiple copies of the data can never be a bad thing. Especially if that data isn't a live copy that gets updated. So we got distributed databases that get updated all the time and everything else. But if you've got that copy that sits in Zerto's instance, 5, 10, 15 seconds behind production on a continuous basis, that doesn't ever get changed, right? So we're kind of in that place where if something did happen to the data and it got corrupted, we can just roll back 15 seconds and know that is a good clean copy of the data to restore to. So I still think having multiple copies of the data that isn't live and isn't writable, I still think is important.
All right. Justin, do you agree with that, or is there another way to think about it? Because you brought up this point about how many versions of the data there are out there. So is there another way to think about this?
Well, I would just say, a good intellectual test, maybe, even if you don't face this as a compliance constraint, if you pretend that you have a compliance constraint, such that you have let's say a consumer with a right to be forgotten, or in a B2B scenario, it might be a company that asks you to purge the data. So how would you answer that purge request in the presence of all of these copies? I think that's a great lens through which to also assess your architecture, and especially if you've got it further there are data values that are further replicated into microservices that are themselves stateful. I think so. Basically, just that's a great question to ask, because that's the one scenario in which more copies is a bad thing, because now you have more that you have to provably purge from, right? So that's related to retention. That's related to every other kind of data destruction case that you affirmatively want to perform. And then, the less granularity you have with your backups, the less control over encryption, maybe the harder that gets.
Right. And then, Bill, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question related to this topic, because I know right now there's probably a cybersecurity guy listening to this going, say what? Because he's like, the attack surface is already big enough, and now you guys are telling me you want to copy more data and have it for backup purposes. But he's going to tell you that the more data there is to protect, the harder his job becomes, and the more likely there's going to be a bad outcome. So is there a middle ground here, or something we can do?
Yeah, I think there is a middle ground, and it's one of those that I have to agree both with Justin and with Chris. Is although there's this spread data everywhere, and although we may be protecting it or monitoring or what have you, there's that point in which you determine, for a stateful application as an example, what data is there, what needs to be protected, and then where does it get stored? Is it that we're storing the entire database, or are we storing parts of it? And then at that point, are we doing the recovery from different places versus one? And I know that sounds like I'm talking in circles, so let me clarify that just real quick. If we're looking at customer data, and I'll just use this as an example, if we're looking at customer data, then do we store it in 2 different locations, and then that way, to Justin's point, we can go back and say, no, this information is what needs to be purged, and it's only in 2 places. Whereas if we look at an entire application, entire microservice, an example, maybe we use that as being the multiple iterations in different locations, because that becomes our bread and butter of what we're trying to save and use, and that's what we're ultimately giving to our customers to go in and utilize on a day-to-day basis. So there becomes that fine line where you determine what exactly needs to be saved, protected, copied, moved, or doing the 3-2-1 overall.
All right. I think Bill said we're shifting to 1.5.1 and 0.5 or something to keep us from getting in too much trouble, but we still need multiple copies of data somewhere along the line. Chris, what is the relationship between the data protection folks and the cybersecurity folks these days? Is that converging, getting tighter? We have seen people talk about when there's a ransomware attack, you need to use data protection as your best defense. But I wonder if we have those processes in place, because a lot of times when I talk to folks, we still have this kind of separated mindset and it's not tightly integrated. So is that getting better?
It's definitely getting closer. I think it could be a lot closer, right? We're seeing, as you said, I think ransomware's really kind of brought that to the forefront, and I think it's everybody's problem, not just cybersecurity and not just the data protection guys. I think everyone in between, even at board level now, I think it's become that prevalent in the marketplace. And it's and it's spread into cloud native already, and SaaS applications as well. People are attacking those. So I think it'll come even closer. The NIST framework is there's in sections, and the last piece is recover, right? And that's a cybersecurity framework, and the last piece of that is all around data protection and how to recover. So if they're not talking, they should be, and if there's not budget for data protection in the cybersecurity, I think that those teams should be talking. And actually, when we're doing things like disaster recovery drills and things, instead of it just being turn everything off and recover everything, what we're doing if we can't get access to certain systems, if your email gets encrypted and you can't send emails to people, your Teams goes down, whatever else, those real life scenarios are becoming a real life event now. So we need to test for those as well. So not just power everything off, move everything and tick the tick box and say, yeah, it was fine. These ransomware attacks have changed the landscape of how we deal with data protection, and it's become a very crucial part of a cybersecurity strategy, right? And those 2 strategies coexist for one reason: to keep the business alive, to keep whatever the business is doing what they're doing, right? So they've all got a common goal, is to keep whatever application is running and safe and secure. So they should be linked intrinsically. And I think that's going to get stronger and stronger as kind of time passes, I suppose.
Yeah. Bill, we hear a lot about DevSecOps these days. Do you think data protection is part of that conversation and in those workflows, or is it still early days?
No, I think that if they're not, they should be. There's too many areas in which, everybody has their own job, and they don't see the cross function to it. So if we're dealing with cybersecurity, they're dealing with just cybersecurity as opposed to protecting what's already there, whether it is, again, customer data, whether it is your own company's data. And, if that protection is not happening, it should be. I do know that there are many companies out there that are seeing this live because of attacks themselves that they've had on themselves, and they're actually bringing that in the fold. So it's not just about, hey, let me go in and build this, but let me go in and build this with the mindset of we have to also secure it in an overall fashion, as well as in I'll just say a micro fashion, right? Minding the store at both the storefront as well as the cash register.
Justin, are there cultural issues at work here, or is it also technical issues that prevent people from kind of integrating these things, or is it just basically, I don't see you, so I don't think about you, and your problems aren't necessarily mine?
I don't know if it's cultural as much as it actually just is a lot of work to get some of this basic stuff right. So I'll say, like you mentioned DevSecOps. That's certainly the intersection of what we deal with as an infrastructure access control product. So the folks that we're dealing with are absolutely deploying the infrastructure, specifying the access to it, and then doing so in an automated way. But what if you add in all of these other dimensions? You add in data protection, you add disaster recovery drills. Okay, I know one way I've thought about it before is sort of right after Hello World, when you're building a new application, the one of the classic applications to build is a to-do list. So if you were to just today in 2022 build a to-do list that was, just one or two basic features, but you apply all of these capabilities. So in terms of being able to respond to ransomware, in terms of being able to actually purge data, right? So I would love to see it. Actually, maybe I challenge someone in the audience to to make a full DevSecOps to-do list where the application isn't the focus, but it's sort of everything around it. It's a lot of work. So when you think of just all of the hours and all of the design that's necessary to specify this precisely, and then actually train on it and drill and be able to respond to these incidents, yeah, it's a lot of work. It could also be fun work, though. I mean, being able to have confidence that you're ready for that ransomware attack, you're ready for it, even on your your SaaS application that has 50 microservices inside of it. I don't know. That can be an empowering feeling for sure.
All right, I don't hear the word fun and data protection in the same sentence. That was good.
I don't know. I think it's all fun. It's always fun for me.
But hey, Bill, is there anything that you know about doing this that you wish you knew a year ago, 2 years ago? People are on different journeys. So, what's the thing that you look at today and you go, wow, I wish I knew that a year or two ago, and that would have helped me out a lot?
Well, I think, and I have to pull the old age card as well, is I think the things that I think about nowadays that I wish I knew back then are the things that are possible. Say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you look at cybersecurity, cyber terrorism, it was a thing, it was a hacker thing, and that was the way it went, as opposed to a true cyber terrorist event. And just the thought patterns around what is vulnerable, how it's vulnerable, and that goes back to Justin's comment on fun. Unfortunately, is it fun to go in and protect your data and see what happens to others as they try to attack it or get the information? Yeah, that can be a little bit of fun. It's a challenge, but then the other side of it is that other things I knew or wish I knew is that where machine learning or AI ops was going, or how we would do things from a development cycle these days, or and we'll go back to the term from earlier, is DevSecOps. It was just DevOps. It was just, let's just build something, let's just create something. Now it's, oh wait, now we not just building something, but we also have to deal with security. And I think that's something I wish I'd known 4, 5, 10 years ago, just from a perspective of building smaller applications into larger structures.
All right. Well, since Bill pulled the age card, I'm going to go over to Chris here and get the opposite perspective. What did you recently discover that surprised you, or you wish you knew earlier, or as it just occurred to you as you were getting into this space with Kubernetes that, wow, I never would have thought of that being an issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think just by the time I've been learning ransomware, I think ransomware's jumped into like containers. I always kind of thought that might have been something that's actually these containers are maybe slightly more protected, or because we're not sharing as much, or because it's we haven't got base operating systems that aren't in the containers, we can't be attacked as much. And actually, when I started researching and doing some bits and pieces, I thought, oh my god, this is already here, right? So like I'm trying to think of something that might come, and it's already here. But I think one thing that I've really learned moving into kind of this area, or continue to move in this area, is the community is great, right? Like someone's got an answer for you, or a piece of advice or something like that. So really like reach out to the community. I think the community is actually one of the best things about Cloud Native and Kubernetes, is that everyone's so helpful and so friendly and happy to kind of talk about their experience and how they're doing things. And then the other thing is kind of always challenge anything that you think, right? So if you think that that's just the way it has to be, think that I've always found there's a different way of doing it, right? So just because we're doing data protection this way in our old environment, or even as Bill said earlier, even if you did that in your first iteration of Kubernetes and your on-prem Kubernetes, now we move to EKS and Azure Kubernetes services and all the other things. That data protection or that security may have to change. The application hasn't changed; it's in a different place, but things are constantly changing. So, yeah, just I think reevaluate every so often about everything. It doesn't have to be every week, every month. It could be security one quarter and then data protection the next and something else the next. But having that constant education inside of your teams or inside of yourself to kind of learn what's actually changed, and it moves so quickly. Is what I'm learning. Is I learn something one week and then I come back to it 2 weeks later and then it's already been updated and I need to learn it again, right? So just constantly challenge and see where you can end up, I think.
All right. I think it was Ben Franklin who said we should all hang together, for surely we will hang separately, but that's a whole separate story. Justin, what's your best advice to folks real quick? What would you tell people to focus on here, or what's the first order of business, the thing that would keep you the most out of trouble?
Sure, the most. I definitely don't have a first recommendation, so I'll just choose among several that seem equally weighted to me. I would definitely say practice. So build a small version, build a lab, and feel what it feels like to simulate a ransomware, right? And do it. Don't just say a ransomware attack has happened. Like actually go rewrite all your Mongo documents. and then experience what it's like to bring Mongo back to life from 15 seconds ago or 15 minutes ago or yesterday, because you're just gonna find stuff. So you're gonna find stuff that's surprising. Your cold start procedure for your application is going to surprise you. So practice, drill, and have fun. That's yeah. So I'll just say the fun word again.
All right, Bill, same question to you. Best advice to folks?
Yeah, no, I love Justin's answer, because that's where I started, was attacking our lab. So that was kind of a long time ago. But I think the biggest thing for my answer would be start somewhere, evaluate what you already have, and then start getting towards a true protection, whether it be on a small scale, large scale, then do the testing against it. Just go back to Justin's answer is fully what it is.
All right. Chris, last question there. Do you want to take it home? But your advice to folks would be, you've seen a lot of companies that you engage with. What do you see as the most common success pattern?
Success pattern. I think Justin kind of hit it, testing. I think the people that test the most are the most successful, and that goes through not just for Kubernetes and cloud native, but all the way through my career in data protection has always been the people that test the most are the most successful, the most prepared. I know that we're talking about data protection, so yeah, I think just testing, and not just testing for the sake of testing or testing to kind of tick an audit checkbox, but actually testing that means something, as Justin said. I don't just say a ransomware attack has happened. Do it. Like get an isolated environment, like stand it up. Put something in there that's going to rewrite something. Put Chaos Monkey in there that's going to rip out some stuff and start things in random orders and see what happens, right? And then see what point of view you're in and how you can recover. And you're going to learn a lot more from that than just by going through a document that says, oh, this is how we recover in a disaster, because no disaster or no backup situation or data protection situation is ever the same twice. There's always going to be a different point in time, a different subset of data, or something's happened. So yeah, I think testing is one of the things that we kind of undervalue dramatically in data protection. A lot of focus is on how we protect the data and how we do it, but maybe how we restore it, how we test it should equally be up there.
All right. Hey, guys, thanks for sharing your time and your expertise. I'm going to hand it back to Cody to take us out.
Thank you.
But this was an
Cheers,
awesome
guys.
presentation, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. A quick reminder for our audience that today's session was recorded. So following this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access the on-demand. You can also find the recording living on the Container Journal website. Real quick, we're going to announce our 4 winners of our Amazon gift card drawing. Our first winner is Gabor L. Our second winner is Kulakani K. Our third winner is Norv L. And our fourth winner is Shiva R. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. Justin, Bill, Chris, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, for sharing your expertise. I'd also like to thank Container Journal for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience, for being here with us for the entirety of today's presentation. This is Cody J. Brown signing off. Have a great day, everyone, and please fill out our post-webinar survey. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.